Today we will look at a very important subject. We will understand how the devil has fomented the great city of Babylon upon all the nations of the world. That Babylon is the great city that reigns above all the kings of the earth, and how this spiritual structure is located throughout the earth by way of webs of communication lines with conduits that unite the great cities that the devil has formed over time throughout the earth. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all nations were deceived. We see here that the great harlot will use some form of enchantment or witchcraft, but at a much higher level than the usual sorceries used by a shaman or sorcerer on people. Rather, it will be a global system of magic by which the harlot will govern the nations of the earth. And this global system is called magical geometry or sacred geometry. Sacred geometry is what the devil began to feed the shamans and priests throughout the great civilizations of ancient times. He gave them the knowledge of how to design and build in the spiritual realm. We must understand that it is the spiritual world that reigns and controls, and it also assigns, dictates, and transforms the natural world. From the beginning, the devil has been very interested in building the spiritual world. From his fall, and when the fallen angels or Nephilim that united with women came to occupy the earth, they established themselves throughout the nations and fomented the great dominions. The devil began to give them revelation of how to connect the great cities with magical locations or points of power in the earth with the goal of having one nation governing all the other nations. So through the use of sacred geometry, Satan starts to show the shamans and priests where the points of power and where the openings are, which will allow portals to connect the abyss with the second heaven. So through the use of sacred geometry, Satan starts to show the shamans and priests where the points of power and where the openings are, which will allow portals to connect the abyss with the second heaven. Let's not forget that this spiritual city will not only cover the high and heavenly places, but also cover the earthly spheres and the nether places. So he begins to create a series of portals and pillars, a whole slew of buildings that will build this spiritual city. This entails assigning magical geometry to the buildings in their designs. It applies to temples, structures, and megaliths such as Stonehenge, which we'll be discussing shortly. It all starts with something called the omphalos, which is the Greek word for navel or belly button. From the beginning of anything, all else stems from one central point. In the universe, everything moves around a central point. All planetary systems orbit around a central point. Families were established and they will all unite around the fireplace to plan and form civilizations. All cities are established around a central point. If you travel to any city anywhere, you will see a central point in it. It is from the center that a city is governed. These central points were then called omphalos of the earth. These earthly belly buttons are the portals or openings that are the primary sources of unification between the spiritual world of darkness and the cities of the earth. So the devil begins by marking these centers of power around the earth. It isn't as simply as some men arbitrarily choosing a random place to build a village and developing into a city. The great civilizations were not established that way, but rather through a demonic intelligence that led them to these strategic points. It is in these places where the power would arise. I've spoken about Mexico being an example of this. Mexico has an omphalos, and in fact the name implies being the navel of the world. Mexico has one of the most important portals of death in the earth, and it is where the Aztecs established their city. Here we see in this figure a classic omphalic formation. Other structures that have an elliptical shape and look like the ball used in football. These are called vesica pieces and are among the most important geometric forms within magical geometry. We see this type of forms in Mecca and in the Vatican, and they are omphalos from which emanates a great power that captivates the masses, which entails making a circle of rocks with a center point where the powers of darkness may be summoned. So they began to connect points of lesser power with points of greater power. Teotihuacan in Mexico, Machu Picchu in Peru. So these ley lines are the ones that connect the different power points from the Earth magnetic grid and will give way to the opening of the portals that allow communication between the underworld or the bowels of the earth with the rest of the universe. All the universe function mathematically, and these magical shapes will become the cornerstones in the edification of all these great temples and consequently the centers of power such as Masonic lodges and all that has to do with occultic magic. Sun rays. And this is why it's so important in many pyramids around the world, the winter solstice and the summer equinox. In Chichen Itza, for example, on March 21st, which is the spring equinox, when the sun strikes an orifice, the serpent of Kukulkan becomes manifested. At the castle of Chapultepec in Mexico, we found a huge tree that was around 300 years old named the General. The site of this tree was used by witches and sorcerers to do their mumbo-jumbo, and the Bible speaks of incantations, idolatries, and fornications committed at the foot of trees. We often find that there are trees where a huge amount of witchcraft and consecrations to the devil have been made at their foot, and be established doors of iniquity, doors that connect with the underworld, or doors that connect with the second heaven. Or mounds where people claim to have seen UFOs. That is because these are points of power connected to ley lines and hence doors to the second heaven, allowing demons to travel up and down that many confuse with UFOs. We also have trees that have like cavities in the shape of a uterus, and these trees are greatly used by sorcerers as well. In Catemaco, Mexico, we found such trees where spells were done and the devil will appear in person. This one particular sequoia tree was full of fetish and witchcraft, all kind of paraphernalia. We also found a human hand, a mutilated hand wrapped in bloody rags and bound spells in the shape of people having intercourse. And many other horrible things that we found under these trees and this sequoia tree or old trees. Sometimes you might find a lush tree in the middle of a desert area. Most likely, this lush tree in the midst of a huge field are key places for shamans and sorcerers to do their spells and incantations. They are clear on fallows, especially if they are in indigenous areas or places of high witchcraft activity. The shamans, the warlocks, and the witches look for such places to do consecrations. They love these isolated, lush trees. Sorcerers also like trees that are located near rivers. Because Yucatan Peninsula, where there are no rivers, the Mayans will use sinkholes or cenotes as doors to connect with their gods and to make sacrifice to them. They will throw virgin maidens and gold down these sinkholes because they were convinced that their gods would receive them. In their belief, these sinkholes contain various levels of the underworld, and as the sacrifices increase, the Mayans will assure a safe passage into the afterlife for their kings or for their relatives. So the universe functions through a symmetry of equal-sided bodies. And he discovered that there were 5 main shapes by which all the magical geometry can be elaborated from. And these magical shapes will become the cornerstones in the edification of all these great temples and consequently the centers of power such as Masonic lodges and all that has to do with occultic magic. So he discovered that these geometric forms that I wanted to name one by one, and the first one is going to be the tetrahedron. And the pyramids in Egypt are made after a tetrahedron, which is composed of 4 triangles. So Plato decided that because of the sharpness of each of the points of these equilateral triangles in the tetrahedron, these 4 points represented the 4 elements. And the tetrahedron will refer to the fire because of its pointy form. The second form he discovered was the octahedron. This results by putting together 8 equilateral triangles, or 2 tetrahedrons. So the octahedron, 8 sides, 8 equal triangles, and this octahedron shape has to do with air. So he theorized, and he felt it this way, that within the octahedron, water would separate from fire and air would be contained in the midst of this shape. So we need to understand these shapes because this is not just about simply looking at a map and tracing some random shape. There are certain shapes that have to do with spiritual entities, and there are certain shapes that connect with other centers of power. And so it becomes very important which shape we have to discover within a map and what are the tracing of the different ley lines or geometric shapes in a spiritual map. The next shape is the cube. And the cube has a total of 6 equal square sides, and being the most solid and stable of all the geometric figures, it is associated with the earth. The next one is the icosahedron, which is comprised of 20 triangles and is theorized as being associated with water. Now, when we look at the powers of the waters and how they function, we will find as well some forms of icosahedrons. Mistaken, the great ball at Epcot Center that looks like a huge golf ball is comprised of a number of icosahedrons, and it is supposed to symbolize the spiritual world and has to do with the waters. Now, the most complicated figure in Plato's geometry is the dodecahedron. The dodecahedron is comprised of 12 pentagons that are united, and according to the great philosophers, is the most mysterious and magical of all the Platonic figures. It also has to do with the great cosmos. So we will see these figures repeated in art, in architecture. We're going to see them repeatedly in the great temples. And so we need to see to what they are connected and why are they connected in this manner. It is important to understand that the great temples of the earth were constructed over ley lines. Temples, or the king's palaces, were not constructed in a random place. There was always a research to find out where two ley lines connected in order to build them in these places so they can become a center of power. In black magic, by example, or wherever diabolical covenants are made, one of the things they usually do is to take dirt from where two roads meet. Where two roads meet, we found there is power in that place. And this is a law that is as well a physical law and a spiritual law. Where two lines cross, and in this case there are ley lines and centers of power, and in such places the witches and the sorcerers draw out dirt in order to strengthen and feeding their conjures. So in these ley lines, temples and the palaces of the kings were built. In Asia, by example, they have a specific name, and they call these lines dragon lines. And the Chinese also understood that there were magnetic lines in the earth, that they were lines of power that united the different points in the layers of the tectonic plates. They will call these dragon lines. The Chinese thought that a great dragon was revealing itself in the earth, and by connecting the dragon lines or ley lines, they could manifest this dragon to govern or to rule all these Asian countries. I remember when we went to Hiroshima to redeem the land from the atomic bomb. Hiroshima is located in a river delta. A delta is where multiple rivers merge, and Hiroshima is edified over this delta. There, we saw a great dragon. If you see the map of Japan, it has the shape of a dragon. And the dragon plays an important role throughout all the Oriental cultures. There we saw that this river that stems from Hiroshima was developing the circulatory system of this dragon. So the Lord directed us to do prophetic acts in order to cancel and to break the power of this dragon. Shortly after came the great tsunami of March 11 in this very important area of witchcraft, and therein is located the head of the dragon, which we had previously tackled through the prophetic acts in Hiroshima. So here we see how the darkness was using the connection of these rivers as conduits. Rivers are highly important in magic geometry. Many of the ancient civilizations were established along the rivers and other bodies of water because the rivers are very powerful conduits of ley lines. And in this case, I will not label them as ley lines because ley lines are necessarily straight lines, but they are nevertheless lines of power because they do connect one point of power with another. Now, let us remember that when the great flood came and it destroyed the whole earth, all the demons that operated on earth lost the human vessels they were operating from, but the water spirits remain intact. And water is a very effective conductor for spirits. All these civilizations do connect through the waters. For example, the Vatican. The city of the Vatican was not founded there because of the supposed burial place of the Apostle Peter. Absolutely not. The Apostle Peter's tomb is definitely not there. The true reason was because of the strategic ley lines that crossed in that place. The Vatican City is perfectly aligned with the pyramids of Egypt and Mecca. And if you analyze the map, you will see this. I remember that in 1999, we were doing a major spiritual warfare that included many nations. And this operation was called Dominion of the Queen, because during that time, Pope John Paul II was planning for the year 2000 to name Mary co-redemptory with Jesus and part of the Trinity. Can you imagine what a horrible abomination this would have been? So we decided we were not going to let this happen. So we did a tremendous assault in the Vatican to stop the works of the devil, bearing in mind that we don't wage war with flesh and blood, but rather against the spiritual forces. And we were not warring against the Pope, but against the powers that were controlling the Pope in that moment. We also wanted the Catholic Church to receive the revelation of salvation through Jesus Christ. So, as we traveled to the site, we noticed how the ley lines were laid out. If you do a bird's eye view of St. Peter's Square, you notice that it looks like an old-style keyhole of a door. Today, the keyholes have a different shape, but in the old days, the keyhole had a round upper part and a rectangular bottom part. So, if you look at St. Peter's Square, it resembles a keyhole. In the middle of the round part, there is an obelisk. When you hear about obelisks, they function as points of demarcation for ley lines. Thus, they are doors that lead as conduits directly to the center of the earth and hell. Wherever there is an obelisk, it is connected to death, and the obelisk represents the god Osiris. In the legend of Osiris, he dies, and then he's placed in the Nile River. Then the goddess Isis cuts off his genitals in order to perpetuate his life and therefore remain alive through the centuries. So she began to promote the establishment of obelisks everywhere, which signifies Osiris' sexual organ through which the earth is procreated and the doors to hell are open. So obelisks are very important since they are portals to hell and they are clear and visible points of ley lines. To the Vatican, and in St. Peter's Square, you can find the obelisk and these ray-like lines that proceeded from it. And these rays are pointing to certain directions, and if you follow the lines which issue out of the obelisk, you will see that St. Peter's Square is well connected as the lines lead to the great temples and the great megaliths of the earth. Is all of this coincidental, or did a diabolical intelligence plan it out? When we took on the Vatican, I remember the Lord telling us that it was constructed like a door. In fact, we will see this door pattern in the building of points of power within the construction of cathedrals. And the Lord directed us to penetrate the Vatican and doing it as if someone is opening a door. And we learned that obelisks are activated, and this is very important to know, that ley lines are activated by way of the sun. So the Lord told us that when dawn was at hand, the shadow of the obelisk will be projected above the door of St. Peter. When the shadow of the obelisk will touch the door of the Basilica of St. Peter, at that precise moment, the spiritual world will open in the Vatican and thus allowing us to enter. So we went there at 4 a.m. in prayer, and we saw a terrible door that was leading to the underworld. And it was one of the most impressionable moments in spiritual warfare that I have ever lived. We literally saw a huge hole, and in this gigantic hole were countless prisons. And there was a terrible demon called the incarcerator. When people in the natural world would arrive at the Vatican, he would trap them and stick them in these prisons. And not only the visitors, but also those connected through the ley lines. So this incarcerator And it is not by coincidence that the Apostle Paul arrived in Rome, and the first thing that happened to him was that he was put into jail because Rome is governed by an incarcerator. So we saw all these prisons and entire nations were caught in them. Incarcerator, and it is not by coincidence that the Apostle Paul arrived in Rome, and the first thing that happened to him was that he was put into jail because Rome is governed by an incarcerator. When the sun casts a shadow, something will happen. So we were all very focused as we look for the extension of the shadow as the sun will arise. Sure enough, the shadow began to grow, but curiously, the shadow did not grow directly above the door as I was expecting, but it was growing towards the left side of the building. And if you look at the door, directly to its left is the statue of St. Peter holding the keys. So the shadow first began to grow over the statue of St. Peter, and at that precise moment, I saw a spiritual road opening up. The Lord instructed me to run quickly. He said, but you have only a few seconds to snatch the keys from that principality that is hidden within the image of what is this supposed St. Peter. So I ran down that spiritual line that the shadow from the obelisk had created. I snatched the keys from St. Peter, and at that moment, as the day was advancing, the shadow began to move slowly towards the right, back towards the entrance door of the Vatican. At that moment, the physical door to the Vatican opened. Our war team entered into the Vatican to take possession of the Basilica of St. Peter, and we began to declare that all the lies and hidden sins of a cult would be exposed and demolished. This was a great battle and a great victory because in the end, Mary was never declared as co-redemptor with Christ and part of the Trinity, or rather the Tetrarchy, as the Pope was intending to call it. So again, it was a great victory. The army of the Lord was able to cut and to obstruct the lines of communication that emanated from the depths of hell through these doors of power, where the designs of the kingdom of darkness are created and emerge onto the earth. Remember, on one occasion, we were in Colorado, and the Lord took us into a profound experience. As we traveled into Nevada, we came across these rock formations, which are also part of this Colorado reddish and desert terrain. And these formations are very much the home of Native American shamans. So I went with a group of prophets to pray into this territory. As the sun began to set, I heard the Lord say to me, beware of the doors of the west, because the world of darkness opens through the doors of the west. The doors to the most powerful type of occult, the most dreadful doors open at the time of sundown. So we are now talking about two types of ley lines. One is the ley lines that are established or activated by the sun rays during the day, during the sunrise. And the second is the ley lines and the doors of the night, the doors of the occult that open at the sundown. In the world of the occult, the occultists call this the white powers and the black powers. Of course, for us it's all dark, but to them it's black and white, because of the polarities of the energies that they deal with. So, anyways, at sundown, the group of prophets that were there, we saw in a vision the doors of the occult begin to open, and we clearly saw these doors to the west opening. Well, in Berlin, Germany, they built the Museum of Pergamon. Remember that the Bible speaks of the temple of Satan as being located in Pergamos? Jesus says in the book of Revelation that Pergamos is the city where Satan has edified his throne. And there was literally a great temple there. So the Germans decided to take this great temple in Pergamos and relocated the entire complex to the islet located in the middle of the river in Berlin. They wanted to build a museum that will have the most powerful temples of the earth. So, besides the throne of Satan in Pergamo, they brought the temple of Inanna directly from Iraq. This is the most ancient temple dedicated to the Queen of Heaven. Along with it, they brought a Hittite temple, which is one of the oldest temples in the Mesopotamian cultures. In total, they brought 6 temples to the location of the islet, and on top, they built a mosque. Next to it, they built a whole museum as a temple dedicated to the Egyptian pharaoh. So, you can imagine the concentration of the powers of darkness brought together in this islet at the river in Berlin. Now, all this construction was done before the Second World War. And when Hitler saw it, he consecrated and used it as his seat of power and declared that because of the powers that were in operation in that islet museum, Germany was never going to be overcome. Of course, he never took into consideration that God would raise up Rees Howells. And Rees Howells, together with his intercessors, will bring down the power of the Third Reich. But nevertheless, this was the declaration that Hitler said about the powers of darkness in this very important envelope of Germany. Well, during the time we took the Museum of Pergamum for the Kingdom of God, it was an extraordinary experience. That the museum had 8 doors, and these 8 doors faced the west. Also, the museum was very well connected with very important points in Berlin. One in particular was the door of Berlin. And all of the most important doors in Berlin faced west. So, it was amazing how we took the Pergamum Museum and we did a lot of very interesting things. Among them, we synchronized our watches and took note of the exact time of sundown according to the observatory. And on that particular day, and I believe it was around 5:21 or 22, and at that moment, and we were all holding
pitchers with oil, and
at the precise time we
broke the pitchers in front of each of the doors inside the museum. And
all of this caused a great noise that was heard throughout the entire building. And then we moved forward to take on the doors of the museum. Now, all this gives you detail of how all these envelopes are edified over time. As we said before, envelopes are umbilical cords or centers of power, and
whoever controls the center controls all the points connected to it. And
this is how centers of powers are built. Among the important portals or gates that we must identify
are caves. And caves are entrances to the spiritual realm.
Also, volcanoes and its craters are very important. And I remember the time the Lord took us to El Salvador, and He said to us to do a spiritual battle at night, and we have to dive into a crater of a volcano that was already a lake, and we did a battle there. So we took all our scuba gear and started the descent into the lake that was in the crater. So as we were going down, and we were with divers, the ones that rented all the equipment to us, and they were not Christian at all. So as we were descending, we literally heard screams. And when we came out of our diving, we started to talk to one another, and even the unbelievers asked us, what was those horrible screams we were hearing? It was like if we were outside in the land. So volcanoes are mouths and doors to hell. And many craters in the volcanoes are named like Mouth of Hell or Satan's Pulpit and things like that. And these craters are directly connected not only to the magma under the earth, but also they are connected to
hell in the
spiritual realm. Now, caves are extremely important because they lead directly to the regions of death. During the time of spiritual warfare in Mexico, that we fought against the powers of death, we had to take all the caves of death in Mexico, and also the mines. All the mines have been consecrated to all kinds of demons. And all the mines are doors to the underworld, to the regions of hell. So whenever we look into the subject of doors, we must include caves. And
Magnetron operates through a hollowed, symmetrical vacuum. It emits powerful microwaves that can act as a source of free energy. If you break the symmetry or close the vacuum, it no longer functions. But can you see the resemblance? These structures were never intended to hold glass within them. The controllers added the stained glass to the rose windows to shut off the magnetron's function. They closed out instruments of free energy. And they are everywhere in these structures. Interestingly, if you look at the geometry of entire sections of the structures themselves, then it becomes very evident that they function in their entirety like a cavity magnetron to generate energy. All cavity magnetrons consist of a central heated circular metal chamber in which the current leaves, and it's called a cathode. Look at that word, cathode. Does it remind you of another word, cathedral? Cathode. Like with everything else, they corrupt the truth and hide things in plain sight. The controllers removed most of the cathodes integral to these cavity magnetrons, but there are some structures today in which you can see traces of the old cathodes still present. The heavy reliance on symmetry and cavities within these structures is not coincidental. The symmetrical ornamentation would have worked in a similar manner, causing the energetic particles to vibrate in a constant manner. The flowers within the squares can be understood as similar to acoustic resonators, working to vibrate the ions. It is here that the energy would have been continually manipulated into vibrational and electromagnetic energy of specific frequencies. Really look at these magnificent acoustic resonators. Could you craft one of these by hand today? And at such height, why would an underdeveloped people spend so much of their time crafting such perfect symmetrical ornamentation, especially if it had no function and was purely aesthetic? They wouldn't. The cavity resonators and magnetrons would have had to have worked in partnership with a central engine or reactor contained within all these structures. Both resonator and reactor are interesting words. Just like the words conductor, generator, creator, and the name Mercator, they all contain the word Tor within their linguistic structure. They hold a linguistic memory and pay homage to the torus or toroidal field. The torus is the flow of electromagnetism. Without this flow of energy, there would be no life on Earth. No one can really know for sure, but some have suggested that the engine was probably similar to a fusion reactor. The traces of these engines can be found within all of the larger generators. The empty shell of where the engine used to reside is usually, but not always, octagonal. It's been right in front of our faces the whole time. The controllers removed the engines. sometimes repurposing the space as baptistries and bandstands, sometimes just leaving the base either barren or attempting to cover them up. We see these octagonal structures in cathedrals, government buildings, mosques, and attached bandstands. And unless they have been repurposed, these structures seem to hold no overall function. They do not contribute to the overall structure. They appear superfluous and unnecessary. Theories of surface of the engines or central technological mechanism were similar to a tokamak. And while I do not subscribe to this idea, which will become evident as to why later in our journey, for now we will use it for illustrative purposes. A tokamak is a powerful device that uses a magnetic field to produce plasma in the form of a torus. The contemporary tokamaks we see are used in thermonuclear fusion power. The tokamak's toroidal field, in conjunction with the vibrating ions from the ether, will have produced a highly conductive electromagnetic field of gases called plasma, just like our sun and ionosphere. If those of the old world used anything closely resembling a tokamak's capability, then the result would have been an abundance of free, powerful, clean electromagnetic energy that could fuel entire cities and the entire earth. These were never churches, cathedrals, castles, and parliament buildings. They were all huge engine generators. The controllers invented labels and terms such as Renaissance, Greco-Roman, and so on to describe the style of these structures. But as you can see, all these magnificent, impossible structures all share the same fundamental structural principles and design, despite location, time period, and cultures. And this is because they were created with the sole purpose of generating energy. And just because these structures were never used for prayer and worship does not mean they were not holy sites. The civilizations of the past had a relationship with the Source and the Holy Spirit, or the Ether, like no other. And they paid homage, reverence, and thanks to it by constructing their generators with such splendor and beauty. And not only that, but they constructed the entirety of their structures, statues, and ornamentation in reverence of this gift, in reverence of the energy production that made their way of life possible in the first place. This is the Columbia World Fair, Chicago, 1893. In the 19th and 20th centuries, World's Fair and expositions celebrated the past while introducing visions of the future. Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 and the Century of Progress World's Fair in 1933 and 34. Often called the fair that changed Chicago, the World Columbian Exposition of 1893 gave us many foods and drinks that are still popular today. Really think about that for a second. Snacks like juicy fruit gum, Cracker Jack, brownies all trace their origins back to the fair. The beef sausage that will become the foundation of the Chicago-style hot dog also made its appearance at the White City. Even Babs Beer has claimed its roots stem back to the exposition where the company won its namesake, Blue Ribbon. Silver buildings nationwide mimic the fair's beautiful art style. The chief architect of the fair, Daniel Burnham, chose the beautiful architectural style for the fair's main buildings. Bold arts and design is characterized by classical details like columns and pediments, highly decorative surfaces, statues and symmetry, and the use of stone. Burnham's choice of style influenced architecture in the United States for several decades, Many turn-of-the-century towns, city halls, libraries, and courthouses look very similar to the buildings at the World Fair. Long before the suffragettes won the right to vote, Chicago socialite Bertha Honoré Palmer fought for women to have a seat at the World's Fair table. Palmer of Palmer House Hotel fame was the chair of the board of lady managers, the first governing body of its kind. The board was instrumental in establishing the Woman's Building at the fair, which was designed by one of America's first architects and MIT graduates, Sophia Hayden. The women's buildings featured arts, crafts, and murals, all created by women. Several cities completed to host the Columbian Exposition of 1893, in addition to Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis, all threw their hats in the ring. While looking back at all the photos published from many different sources, I could never find any real pictures of people working or constructing the World Fair. The only depictions I could find were paintings. Why are we able to find all of these magnificent pictures of the World Fair and people actually in the World Fair, but we don't find any pictures of people constructing the World Fair? It's only paintings. Now, why do you think that it's only paintings? They even have pictures of the fires that burnt it, but they don't have pictures of the construction that built it. The only thing close to construction that I was able to find were a few immigrants painting an already pre-existing structure. So why do they have pictures of people painting certain parts and not have pictures of people constructing any part? Just think about that. Think about this one. St. Louis, USA. The St. Louis Fair was built on a swamp of 1,200 acres of redesigned landscape, which featured gardens, numerous lakes, canals, and bodies of water, 1,500 beautiful structures, and several grand palaces. Allegedly, most of the buildings were temporary structures made of plaster of Paris. The fair was fully electrified and lit up in the night sky, along with the truly astounding temporary architectural wonders. The most modern inventions were featured, and different tribes and races of people were shipped from all over the world and put in on display as a cultural wonder. Allegedly, all of this took 3 years to build and only stood for 7 months. Now, do you think one would go through all of this trouble to build these structures and destroy them within 7 months?
Over 300,000 planets that's conducive of life just on the edge of the Milky Way where we are. Other life forms have been here before we were here. They're here while we're here. And they will be here when we are gone. Y'all understand that? Well, they had a picture of some sister in a spaceship with locks. And the ship was 100,000 years old. So we're not talking about aliens came here and did that. We are the aliens. Understand your roots. Understand where you are coming from. You have been upside down, inside out, and backwards your whole life, and you wonder why you can't put things together. All of this is coming out of our sun and held within the gravitational pull of our sun. So we are magnetic. We have energy. We can repel. We can attract, just like a magnet. Our blood is liquid crystal. Our blood, if you dry our blood up, it crystallizes like a snowflake. Our blood is liquid crystal. We are crystal beings. That's why these crystals can aid us on our journey. These ships, and they found one of these ships on back of the moon that was there from billions of years. They say 1 billion years, but we know that ship been there 24 billion years ago, right? The ship was there 24 billion years ago, and it was shot down by the reptilians, right? And they found a being inside the ship, a black woman inside the ship. Did you know about that? The black woman found on back of the moon, right? Inside the ship, right? From 24 billion years ago, that was shot down by reptilians. And that particular woman that they found was an avatar for the Anunnaki beings. Our family, right? Our family who are the Anunnaki, because there's different type of Anunnakis, right? There are reptilians, right? And it depends on what point of view the story is coming from. A new could be the bad guy, right? If something depends on who telling the story, a new could be the bad guy, right? And the reptilians could be the good guys, depending on what point of view the story coming from, right? Sananda the Fool, who's the leader of the Ashtar Command, to be the good guy, and they just look like the bad guys, which is what they're doing now.
You sure he's dead?
If it wasn't true, I wouldn't call you.
Must really eat you up that you're not the one who killed him.
None of us killed him. They did. They're beginning to touch the multiverse. And if we let them, they will take everything we built. So let's stop wasting time. We're late.
How many did you call?
All of us.
Yeah, I learned a lot about the power 10 in this culture. So, figure I can put it down like this. I'm a power 10, I'm a Eastwood-land Indian and original All-American. My skin color is thin, man. You can say it's brown and just look at my head, one side shade down. Look at me now, my body marked up, red paint on my face, no clothes on my butt. What? Nah, tear skin cover up, my bow on my side, I let the arrow glide. I'm a hunter, a farmer, a fisherman. Everything that I need, I get from the land. I make my own clothes, my own weapons too. When you see the moccasins, then I'm stepping through. I'm a power 10, I'm a power 10. I'm a power 10, I'm a power 10. I'm a power 10, I'm a Eastwood-land Indian and original All-American. I'm ruling everything. That's right. Call me the big chief. Power 10, everybody else is beneath. All the villages, each and every tribe. I make the laws, I control if you live a chiefs under me that collect the tax. Animal skin bees while I just relax. Collecting deer and turkey, put them in the temple. Power 10 government is just that simple. I'm a power 10, I'm a power 10. I'm a power 10, I'm a Eastwood-land Indian. Let me break it down so you understand. Man, I was very young. That's right. When I took my spouse, she took my bills, in my longhouse. From jewelry to pottery, we got art. True. Even kids do it big. Yeah, we work hard, but we play too. That's right. Games just like you. Wrestling, foot race. We're very musical. We like to sing and dance, party and clap our hands. Celebrating life, I'm like a power 10. I'm a power 10, I'm a power 10. I'm a power 10, I'm a power 10.